Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Eagle Eye Apache. Throw another log on the fire and pull your blanket a little closer. The wind is picking up out there in the dark. And tonight, the story matches the weather. When we last left Gideon, he had risen from the ashes of betrayal. He stood in the healing lodge, his wounds bound with the medicine of the earth, and he made a promise to the fire. He said, "The storm is coming, but I am the thunder." He wasn't running anymore. He was ready to turn the hunters into the hunted. Tonight, that storm finally breaks. Tonight, we witness the reckoning. So, close your eyes. Let the walls of your room fade away. Let's go back to the high country, where the air is thin and the stakes are life and death. The sky did not look like the sky anymore. Above the spirit, lands that sacred, twisted geography of ancient pines and rock formations that looked like the spines of sleeping dragons. The heavens were bruised. It wasn't just night. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of deep purples, angry blacks, and a strange, sickly green that promised violence. Here, in this holy place, the thunder didn't roll from the clouds. It seemed to groan from the earth itself, vibrating up through the soles of your boots, rattling the bones in your chest. It was the sound of the mountain growling. Gideon stood on the high ridge, a solitary figure against the brewing tempest. The wind whipped his dark hair across his face, stinging his eyes. But he did not blink. He was no longer the man in the tailored suit of the capital. He was no longer just the marshal bound by a badge. In this moment, standing on the edge of the precipice, he was the land itself, preparing to defend its heart. Below him, they came. They moved like a plague of locusts, devouring the horizon. Over 100 men, mercenaries with greed in their eyes, their saddles creaking under the weight of ammunition meant to erase a people. The sound of their approach was a cacophony of iron and leather, a foreign dissonance in the sacred silence of the spirit lands. But they were not alone. Bolstering their ranks was a shadow unit, men with faces hidden behind black scarves, moving with a rhythm that made Gideon's blood run cold. They didn't move like hired guns who fought for coin. They moved with the disciplined formation of the law. They rode in columns, their posture rigid, their rifles held with practiced ease. Lightning flashed a jagged tear in the purple sky, and for a split second, the valley was bathed in a stark, blinding white light. It illuminated a glint of silver beneath a masked man's coat. Gideon stopped. His breath hitched in his throat. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He recognized the stance. He recognized the way the man held his rifle across his chest, barrel up, finger alongside the guard. He recognized the badge. These were not outlaws. These were his former brothers, corrupt deputies, men he had once shared coffee with in the warm station house, men who had sworn the same oath to protect and serve. They had been sent by the capital not to arrest him, but to ensure his silence. The betrayal should have broken him. It should have sent him to his knees. But his heart didn't break. It hardened. It turned into the same granite that formed the ridge beneath his feet. The last tether to his old life snapped in that flash of lightning. He turned to his force. 40 Apache warriors. That was all. 10 elders with winter in their hair and the history of the mountains in their lined faces. 30 young bloods with fire in their veins and fear in their eyes. They looked at Gideon, then down at the army below. Outnumbered 3-1. Outgunned. Surrounded. But numbers are the math of the white man. Numbers are for counting coins and plotting maps in warm offices. Here, in the spirit lands, the math is different. Here, the wind fights for you. Here, the rocks hide you. Here, the shadows have teeth. Gideon looked at his brothers, and he didn't see fear anymore. He saw the storm, and he knew, deep in his blood, that the darkness was about to scream. The sun died. It didn't set with the grace of a summer evening. It was swallowed whole by the horizon, strangled by the bruising clouds that had gathered like a judgment over the spirit lands. And the moment the light was extinguished, the storm finally broke. It wasn't just rain. To call it rain would be a kindness. It was a deluge, a vertical ocean falling from the sky. It fell in sheets so thick, so heavy, that if you looked up, you felt like you were drowning on dry land. The temperature plummeted, dropping 20 degrees in the span of a single heartbeat. The air turned from the muggy heat of the coming conflict to the bone-deep chill of the grave. Down in the valley, the world turned into a chaotic soup of mud and noise. The sound of the rain was deafening, a constant, roaring static that erased the sound of footsteps, erased the sound of breathing, erased everything but the pounding of your own heart in your ears. From his perch on the high ridge, Gideon watched. He didn't flinch as the water soaked through his clothes, plastering his hair to his skull. He stood perfectly still, letting the water run off him like it runs off a stone. He watched the army below. He watched them make their first fatal mistake. Panic is a cold thing, and it makes men crave warmth. It makes them crave sight. Below, amidst the roar of the storm, a flicker of orange light appeared. Then another, then a dozen. The mercenaries and the masked deputies were lighting torches. They were soaking rags in oil, shielding them with their hats until they caught fire. The flames sputtered and hissed against the downpour, fighting a losing battle against the night. They held the torches high, desperate to push back the encroaching blackness, desperate to see what was waiting for them in the trees. Gideon watched the lights bobbing in the dark, and a grim satisfaction settled in his chest. They didn't understand. They were thinking like men who lived in houses with gas lamps. They thought light was safety. But in the wilderness, in the spirit lands, light is not safety. Light reveals position. Light destroys your night vision. Light tells the predator exactly where the prey is standing, while leaving the predator cloaked in the void. They had turned themselves into beacons. They were fireflies in a jar, waiting to be extinguished. Darkness. Gideon whispered, the word lost to the wind. Darkness is infinite. Darkness is a blanket. He raised his hand. He did not shout. A shout would be human. And tonight, they were not fighting a human war. He did not fire a gun. A gunshot is a declaration of presence. Instead, he cupped his hands around his mouth and gave the signal. It was a sound that belonged to the nightmares of the frontier. The mournful, terrifying trill of a screech owl. It cut through the bass notes of the thunder. A high-pitched, shivering cry that sounded like a spirit in pain to the men below. It was just a bird, perhaps spooked by the storm. To the 40 warriors waiting in the brush, it was the opening bell. The psychological warfare began. The Apache did not attack the line. That would be suicide. You do not charge 100 rifles. Instead, they attacked the mind. They attacked the very concept of safety. They moved through the brush without breaking a twig. They didn't walk on the ground. They flowed over it. They knew where the roots twisted. They knew which rocks were slippery with moss and which offered a foothold. They were ghosts in the storm. Unencumbered by heavy coats or heavy boots, they struck from the void. The first man to fall was a mercenary at the rear of the column. He had stepped away from the light of the torches to relieve himself. He never saw the hand that covered his mouth. He never felt the knife that slipped between his ribs. He was there one moment, and then he was simply gone. No scream, no thud, just a vacancy where a man used to be. Then, the arrows began to fly. But these were not the flaming arrows of dime store novels. These were silent hunters. An arrow whistled through the rain, a sound like tearing silk, and found its mark in the shoulder of a man holding a torch. The torch dropped into the mud and hissed out. Darkness reclaimed that patch of ground. Another arrow struck a deputy's leg. He screamed, and the sound shattered the fragile composure of the unit. "Contact!" someone shouted. "Right flank, contact." The mercenaries spun around. Raising their rifles, they fired blindly into the blackness. Crack, crack, crack. The muzzle flashes illuminated the rain for a fraction of a second, freezing the falling droplets like diamonds. But the light revealed nothing. No charging warriors. No painted faces. Just the gnarled trunks of the ancient pines and the empty, wet, dark. They weren't shooting at warriors. They were shooting at their own fear. "I don't see them," a voice cried out, cracking with hysteria. "Where are they?" "Hold the line," the captain roared. But his voice was swallowed by a peal of thunder that shook the ground. "Keep the torches up." But the torches were dying. One by one, the bearers were targeted. It was surgical. It was precise. It was terrifying. As each light went out, the circle of the known world shrank. The mercenaries began to back into each other, their boots slipping in the rising mud. They pointed their weapons at the trees, at the rocks, at the shadows that seemed to be moving. Was that a bush moving in the wind? Or was it a man with a tomahawk? Was that the sound of rain on leaves? Or was it the sound of a footstep? Paranoia is a potent poison. It works faster than venom. Gideon moved through the chaos like a phantom. He had descended from the ridge and was now among them. He didn't run. He stalked. The rain washed over him, and he welcomed it. He was part of the storm now. He saw a figure stumbling through the brush, a man with a black scarf over his face, separated from the main group, his rifle shaking in his hands. The man was spinning in circles. Terrified, Gideon stepped out from behind the trunk of a massive oak. He didn't attack immediately. He let his presence be felt. The deputy spun around, gasping, raising his rifle. But Gideon was faster. He stepped inside the guard, his hand chopping down on the man's wrist. The rifle fell into the mud with a wet slap. Gideon grabbed the man by his coat, pulling him close. The deputy struggled, his eyes wide with terror above the black mask. He looked into Gideon's eyes and saw no mercy, no humanity. He saw only the abyss. Gideon didn't draw his knife. He didn't need to. He leaned in, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "You brought the law of the city here," Gideon whispered. "But the city is far away," the deputy whimpered, his knees buckling. "Darkness is not a place to hide," Gideon said, the words cutting through the rain. "Darkness is the weapon, and you are holding nothing but a candle." Gideon shoved the man backward. The deputy tripped over a root and sprawled into the mud, scrambling away on his hands and knees, sobbing, completely broken. He didn't reach for his gun. He just wanted to get away from the eyes of the wolf. The spirit lands had become a mirror. It was reflecting the deepest, darkest nightmares of the invaders back at them. They were men who believed in ownership, in lines on a map, in the authority of paper. But here, the land owned them. The rocks were tripping them. The mud was sucking at their boots, holding them in place. The rain was freezing their hands until they couldn't work the actions of their rifles. They were fighting a force they couldn't see, a force that knew every ravine, every tree root, every shift in the wind. A mercenary fired a shotgun into a bush, blowing the leaves apart. A split second later, an Apache warrior dropped from the branch above him, landing silently, the handle of a war club connecting with the mercenary's temple. The warrior was gone into the brush before the man even hit the ground. "They're in the trees," someone screamed. "They're everywhere. Retreat," another voice yelled, abandoning all pretense of discipline. "Fall back to the ridge." But there was no falling back. The formation had disintegrated. It wasn't an army anymore. It was 100 frightened individuals, stumbling in the dark, firing at each other, screaming at the thunder. Gideon stood in the center of the storm, the rain running down his face like tears. He watched the chaos he had orchestrated. He felt the pulse of the spirit lands beating in time with his own heart. The Alpha had returned, and the pack was feeding. The battle did not end with a bang. It ended with a collapse. You have to understand. Fear is a heavy thing to carry. It weighs more than a rucksack full of lead. And for the men down in that valley, men who had come seeking easy gold and easier murder, the weight became too much to bear. The psychological dam broke. The discipline of the shadow unit, the bravado of the mercenaries. It all shattered like glass dropped on a stone floor. They stopped listening to orders. They stopped trying to hold the line. The primal instinct to survive overrode everything else. They ran. They scrambled blindly into the deep ravines that cut through the spirit lands like scars. They thought the earth would offer them shelter. They thought the high walls of the canyons would protect them from the arrows that flew from the dark. But they were wrong. They were running into the throat of the wolf. Gideon had placed his warriors well. The ravines weren't escape routes. They were funnels. As the mercenaries stumbled into the narrow passes, slipping on the wet shale, their breath coming in ragged gasps, they found the Apache waiting. It was close quarters now. The distance of the rifle was gone. It was the intimacy of the knife and the war club. It was a massacre of the mind that had bled into a breaking of the body. The storm raged on, drowning out the cries, washing away the sins of the night as quickly as they were committed. But, and there is always a but in stories like this, victory is never free. We like to think of heroes as invincible, like the figures in marble statues. But flesh is soft, and bullets are hard, and war does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. Victory always demands a blood price. And that night, the spirit lands came to collect. As the storm began to lose its fury, fading into a gray, weeping drizzle, the enemy made a desperate last stand. Backed against a rock wall, a group of mercenaries opened fire with everything they had left. It was a wall of lead, a frantic, blind unleashing of death, and 10 brave souls walked into it. 10 Apache warriors. I want you to picture them, not just as numbers, but as men. There was little Hawk, a boy of only 17 who had just earned his first feather. He fell shielding an elder from a shotgun blast. There was Grey Wolf, a father of 3, who taught Gideon how to listen to the wind when he was just a scared boy in a suit. He went down fighting, a song of defiance on his lips. There was Stone River, the keeper of the old stories, whose mind held the history of 1,000 years. A single bullet silenced a library of wisdom. They fell in the mud. The rain mixed with their blood, carrying it down into the roots of the ancient pines. They did not die in a hospital bed. They did not die of old age. They died holding the line for their children. They died so that the treaty would be more than just paper. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the jagged peaks of the Sawtooths, a strange thing happened. The mist began to rise from the valley floor. Thick, white, curling mist. To the surviving mercenaries, it looked like weather. But to Gideon, standing amidst the carnage, it looked like something else. It looked like spirits rising. It looked like the ancestors coming down from the peaks to collect their own. 10 sown. 10 ghosts joining the wind. When the rain finally stopped, the silence that followed was heavier than the thunder had been. It was a physical weight. It pressed against the eardrums. The screaming had stopped. The gunfire had ceased. There was only the drip. Drip. Drip of water falling from the pine needles, and the ragged breathing of the survivors. The battle was over. Only 20 men remained alive out of the 100 who had marched in. They were huddled together, shivering uncontrollably. They had dropped their guns hours ago. Their expensive coats were shredded, their boots ruined, their arrogance washed away by the storm. They looked small. They looked human, kneeling in the mud. Separated from the rest were the 2 architects of this nightmare. The mercenary captain, a man who had bragged in saloons that he could kill anything that walked, was slumped forward, cradling a broken arm. His eyes were hollow, staring at nothing. And beside him, the leader of the shadow unit, the corrupted lawman. His black scarf had been pulled down, revealing a face pale with shock. The silver badge on his chest, once a symbol of honor, was smeared with dirt. A shadow fell over them. They looked up. Gideon stood there. He did not look like a marshal. He did not look like a man who walked in the Capitol. The rain had washed away the dust, but it hadn't washed away the war paint. Streaks of ash and ochre crossed his face. His clothes were dark with mud, and blood, some his own, some not. He stood perfectly still, breathing slow and deep. In the gray light of dawn, he looked like a spirit summoned by the storm to judge the living. The mercenary captain flinched. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the bullet. He knew the rules of the frontier. He knew what he would have done if the roles were reversed. He expected the execution. He expected the cold metal against his temple. The Apache warriors tightened their grip on their weapons. They looked at their fallen brothers, then at the men kneeling in the mud. Their eyes demanded justice. Their blood called out for it. Gideon raised his hand. He looked at the captain. He looked at the corrupt deputy. He saw the fear in their eyes, the absolute terror of men who know they are about to meet their maker. His hand drifted to the handle of his revolver. The leather creaked, but he didn't draw. Gideon knew something these men didn't. He knew that a dead man is just a corpse. A dead man cannot speak. A dead man cannot point a finger in a courtroom. A dead man cannot unravel a conspiracy that reached all the way to the Senate. If he killed them here, in the mud, it would be justice for the dead. Yes, but it wouldn't save the living. It wouldn't save Thorne. It wouldn't save the land permanently. He needed them, not as trophies. He needed them as weapons. Gideon took a step forward. The sound of his boots squelching in the mud was loud in the silence. He loomed over the corrupt lawman. "Look at me," Gideon whispered. The man looked up, trembling. "You came here to bury the truth," Gideon said, his voice sounding like grinding stones. "Rough and deep. You came here to silence us." Gideon leaned in, closer, his dark eyes burning with a cold, blue fire. "But the earth refused to take you. And now, you belong to me." Gideon reached down. He didn't strike the man. He grabbed him by the lapels of his ruined coat and hauled him to his feet. He did the same to the captain, dragging him up from the mud. The warriors watched, confused. "Gideon," one of the elders murmured. "Blood for blood." Gideon turned to his people. He pointed to the 10 bodies of their fallen kin, lying respectfully covered in blankets nearby. "Their blood is sacred," Gideon said, his voice carrying through the valley. "And it is too precious to be paid for with the lives of these dogs. Killing them is too easy. Death is sleep. And I do not want them to sleep." He turned back to the prisoners, his face inches from theirs. "I want you to sing," Gideon said. "I want you to tell the world what you did. I want you to name the men who paid you. I want you to destroy the men in the high towers." He shoved them toward the path that led out of the spirit lands, toward the train tracks, toward the long journey back to civilization. "Get up," Gideon commanded. "You have a story to tell. And you are going to tell it to the whole damn world." The Alpha had not just won the battle. He had secured the war. The train ride back to the east was a funeral procession for the old way of doing things. The iron horse screamed across the plains, tearing through the silence with a rhythm that hammered against Gideon's temples. Clack, 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 clack. It was the heartbeat of the machine world, eating up the miles, dragging him away from the sagebrush and the pine, back toward the smoke and the stone. Gideon sat by the window, watching the world change. He watched the vast, open ocean of grass give way to fences. He watched the fences give way to shacks, and the shacks give way to brick factories that belched gray soot into the sky. He watched the wildness get strangled, mile by mile. Across from him sat the prisoners, the mercenary captain and the corrupt deputy. They were shackled, hand and foot, their heads bowed. They didn't look like monsters anymore, without their guns, without the cover of darkness. They looked small. They looked like what they were, men who had sold their souls for coin and found the price was too high. Delivering them to the authorities was the easy part. A man in chains is easy to hand over, but making the powerful listen, making the blind see, that was the real war. And Gideon knew, as the train pulled into the cavernous, echoing station of the capital, that the hardest fight hadn't been in the spirit lands. It was just beginning. 5 months. For 5 grueling, suffocating months, Gideon fought a battle not with bullets, but with words, not with arrows, but with testimony. He had to trade his buckskins for a suit. It was a fine suit, tailored black wool, stiff, white collar, but to Gideon, it felt like a shroud. It felt like a costume he had outgrown years ago. It pulled at his shoulders. It choked his neck. Every time he put it on, he felt like he was putting the cage back around his own heart. But he wore it. He wore it because it was armor. He stood in the marble halls of justice, places where the air smelled of floor wax and stale cigar smoke, places where the only light came through high, dusty windows. He stood there, a wolf among the sheepdogs. The lawyers tried to tear him apart. They tried to discredit him. They called him a savage. They called him a traitor to his badge. They tried to bury the truth under mountains of paperwork and objections. But Gideon was relentless. He possessed a patience they did not understand, the patience of a hunter waiting by a deer trail. He waited for them to make mistakes. He waited for the lies to contradict themselves. And he forced the city to look. He dragged the prisoners onto the stand. He forced the corrupt deputy to speak. And when that man spoke, when he finally cracked under the weight of Gideon's stare, the confession poured out like black water from a broken dam. He named names. He didn't just name the mercenaries. He named the men who hired them. He named the mining magnates who sat in plush offices, smoking Cuban cigars, while ordering the genocide of a people. He named the politicians who took bribes to look the other way. The conspiracy unraveled. At first, it was just a loose thread. Then, the whole tapestry began to tear. The newspapers got a hold of it. The civilized savage had returned. Not to entertain them, but to judge them. The headlines screamed the truth. The public outrage grew. The corrupt officials, men who thought they were untouchable gods in their high towers, began to fall, one by one, like dominoes made of glass. And finally, the day came. The grand chamber of the Senate was packed. There wasn't an empty seat in the gallery, but a hush had fallen over the room. A silence so profound you could hear the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light. At the front of the room, behind a massive mahogany desk that looked like an altar, sat Senator Thorne. He looked different. The months in prison had taken a toll. His skin was pale, almost translucent, like parchment paper. His hands trembled slightly, a tremor of the nerves that would never quite leave him. He was frail, but his eyes burned with an unbroken spirit. They were clear. They were fierce. He looked out at the room, at the men who had imprisoned him, and he did not blink. Laid out before him was the document, the peace treaty. It was no longer a dirty secret discussed in backrooms. It was no longer a rough draft hidden in a safe. It was a federal mandate, stamped with the seal of the United States. It was a shield made of paper, strong enough to stop an army. Thorne picked up the pen. He dipped it into the inkwell. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper was the loudest thing Gideon had ever heard. It was louder than the thunder in the spirit lands. It was louder than the cannons of the war. Scritch, scratch. It was the sound of history bending. Thorne signed his name. Then, he passed the pen to the president's representative. The ink dried. It sealed the Sawtooth Ridge, the spirit lands, and the valleys of the Apache forever, under the protection of federal law. No mining, no settlement, no displacement. It was done. The room erupted. It started as a ripple of applause and grew into a roar. Men in expensive suits, men who had likely doubted Thorne only weeks ago, were now standing on their feet, clapping, cheering, desperate to be on the right side of history. They turned. They swiveled their heads, looking toward the back of the room. They were looking for the hero. They wanted to find the marshal. They wanted to shake his hand. They wanted to pin medals on Gideon's chest, heavy ribbons of gold and silk. They wanted to offer him a promotion to chief marshal. They wanted to give him a mansion on the hill, a title, a comfortable life. They wanted to own him. They wanted to put him in the golden cage, lock the door, and display him as the man who bridged the worlds. The applause swelled, waiting for him to step forward and bow. But the back of the room was empty. The heavy oak doors were slightly ajar, letting in a draft of cold air from the street. Gideon was gone. He had not stayed for the accolades. He had not stayed for the champagne toasts or the photographer's flashbulbs. He had not stayed to be turned into a statue. His war was done. The paper was signed. The debt to his father was paid. Gideon was walking away from the marble halls. He was walking away from the power, the influence, and the future they tried to write for him. He was walking toward the train station. He stripped off the tie as he walked, stuffing it into a trash bin. He unbuttoned the collar that choked him. His heart was not in this city of stone. His heart was not in the laws of men. His heart was waiting in a cabin, thousands of miles to the west, where the air tasted like pine needles and freedom, where the only applause was the wind in the trees, and the only judgment came from the mountains. He moved with the urgency of a man who knew that time was the only enemy left to fight. The ink on the treaty was barely dry. The applause in the Senate chamber was still echoing off the marble walls, a sound of victory that meant everything to the history books and nothing to his heart. Gideon didn't stop to shake the hands that reached for him. He didn't stop to accept the champagne or the accolades. He turned his back on the gilded cage of the Capitol, walked out into the gray afternoon, and boarded the westbound train. He watched the stone city fade into the smoke and distance. He watched the spires of influence and the towers of law shrink until they were nothing more than a smudge of graphite on the horizon. He stripped off the black coat of the politician. He loosened the tie that had felt like a noose for 5 months. He took a breath, and for the first time since he left the spirit lands, the air actually reached the bottom of his lungs. Then, the journey began. Day after day, the wheels turned. The great iron beast surged forward, a rhythmic lullaby eating up the miles, racing against the turning of the earth. Clack, clack. Clack, clack. Clack, clack. It was a hypnotic sound. To the other passengers, it was just the noise of travel. But to Gideon, it was a chant. It was a heartbeat. Going home. Going home. Going home. He sat by the window, watching the world unravel and reknit itself. He watched the claustrophobic forests of the East give way to the rolling farmland of the Midwest. He watched the green turn to gold, and the gold turn to the dusty red of the plains. He watched the fences disappear. He barely slept. How could he? Every mile was a physical ache. Every stop for water and coal felt like an eternity. He paced the aisles while the other passengers dozed, his eyes fixed on the western horizon, willing the sun to move faster, willing the engine to burn hotter. As the train began the long, arduous climb into the territory, the air inside the car changed. It grew thin. It grew sharp. It tasted of high elevation and ancient stone. Gideon leaned his forehead against the cool glass. He watched condensation form, a fog of his own breath obscuring the view. And then, he saw it, a single white flake, dancing against the window pane. Then another. Then 1,000. The world outside turned white. The wind picked up, howling around the metal shell of the train cars. Gideon stared at the snow, and a realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at the calendar hanging on the wall of the train car. It was exactly 1 year. To the day, the seasons had turned a full circle. His mind flashed back, vivid and visceral. He saw himself as he was 12 months ago, a broken thing, a bleeding, half-frozen marshal, slumped over. He remembered the numbness. He remembered the despair. He remembered the belief that he was riding into his own grave. He remembered the sight of a cabin through the blizzard. He remembered a woman with eyes like flint and a heart like a hearth. The winter had returned. The snow was falling just as hard. The wind was biting with the same venom. But this time, the man riding through it was not dying. He was not broken. He was alive. For the first time in his entire life, for the first time since he was a boy pulled from the ashes of his childhood home, Gideon was truly, completely living. He wasn't running from anything anymore. He was running to something. The train hissed to a halt at the station. The steam billowed out, blinding and white. Before the conductor could even place the step stool on the platform, Gideon was off. He didn't look for a carriage. He didn't look for a horse to rent. He didn't wait for a greeting from the townspeople who might have recognized the hero of the newspapers. He ran through the streets of the small town, ignoring the startled looks of the shopkeepers. He hit the trailhead, the path that led up the Sawtooth Ridge, and he didn't slow down. The snow crunched under his boots. It was a familiar sound, a memory written in ice. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The cold bit at his face, stinging his cheeks, freezing his eyelashes. But he felt nothing but the heat of anticipation burning in his chest. It was a fire that kept him warm, a furnace stoked by 5 months of separation. He climbed the elevation that would have winded a lesser man, his lungs pumping the thin air, his legs driving him upward, toward the tree line. He imagined the scene waiting for him. He imagined the smoke curling from the chimney, a gray ribbon against the white sky. He imagined the smell of coffee and stew. He imagined the door opening before he even knocked, because she would know. She always knew. He crested the final rise. The clearing opened up before him. The cabin stood there, nestled against the granite spine of the mountain. Gideon stopped. The smile that had been building on his face faltered. Then, it vanished. The silence terrified him. There was no smoke rising from the chimney. The air above the roof was clear and cold. There was no movement in the yard. The snow around the porch was unbroken, a pristine sheet of white that said no one had stepped out in hours. No one had gathered wood. No one had cleared a path. The stillness was heavy. It was oppressive. It didn't feel like peace. It felt like abandonment, panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his gut. Had the mercenaries returned? Had he been too late? Had the winter taken what the war could not? He took a step forward, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Mercy," he called out. The wind snatched his voice away, shredding it against the pines. There was no answer, only the whistle of the gale through the eaves. He ran to the porch, his boots thudding heavily on the wood. He reached for the latch, his hand trembling not from the cold, but from a fear he had never felt on the battlefield. "Mercy," he shouted again, desperation creeping into his tone. And then, a sound cut through the winter air. It stopped him cold. His hand froze on the latch. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a wolf. It was a cry. But it wasn't a scream of terror. It wasn't a cry of despair. It was primal. It was guttural. It was the sound of life fighting to enter the world. It was a sound as old as the mountain itself, raw and undeniable. It was the sound of labor. Gideon's eyes went wide. The calendar in his head spun. The months, the timing. He didn't think. He didn't breathe. He threw his shoulder against the door and burst into the room. Fear is a strange thing. Gideon had known fear on the battlefield. He had known the cold pit in the stomach before a gunfight. He had known the terror of being hunted in the dark. But this was different. This fear was sharp, and it pierced him deeper than any bullet ever could. He burst through the door, bringing a swirl of snow and freezing air with him. The cabin, usually a sanctuary of warmth, was cold. The fire in the hearth had burned down to sullen red embers, fighting a losing battle against the draft. And there, in the dim light, was Mercy. She was gripping the iron bed frame, her knuckles white with the strain. Her face was pale, translucent like fine china, and sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the chill in the room. She looked up as the door banged shut. Her eyes were wide, filled with a terrifying mixture of pain and relief. "You came back," she whispered, the words barely audible over the wind outside. "I told you I would," Gideon said, his voice choking. He rushed to her side, dropping to his knees. He took her hand, and it was cold. Too cold. He saw the fear in her eyes, a reflection of his own. The baby was coming. It was coming now, and she was alone in the winter dark. "Hold on," Gideon commanded. He squeezed her hand, trying to pour his own strength into her, trying to anchor her to the earth. "Just hold on. Do not let go." He stood up. It was the hardest thing he had ever done to turn his back on her when she needed him most. But he knew he couldn't save her with just a gun and a badge. He needed help. He ran back out into the snow, the door latching behind him. He sprinted toward the stable, his lungs burning in the thin air. Inside the stable, it was dark and smelled of hay and animal heat. And there, waiting in the stall, was the horse. It wasn't just any horse. It was the horse he had left for her months ago. The horse he had given up so she wouldn't be stranded. The beast snorted, its ears flicking forward. It recognized the scent of its master. It recognized the man who had ridden it across the plains. It whinnied in the cold air, a cloud of steam rising from its nostrils like a dragon's breath. Gideon didn't bother with a saddle. There was no time for straps and buckles. There was no time for comfort. He grabbed the mane, twisting the coarse hair in his fist, and swung up. He mounted bareback, his legs gripping the animal's warm flanks. In that moment, the separation between man and beast dissolved. They merged. They became one creature, driven by a single, desperate purpose. He kicked the horse into motion, bursting out of the stable and onto the trail. He rode not as a marshal hunting a fugitive. He rode not as an Apache hunting an enemy. He rode as a father. And a father fighting for his family is the most dangerous thing on God's green earth. He tore down the mountain path. The horse seemed to understand the stakes. It didn't hesitate. It threw itself down the treacherous, icy slopes. Hooves struck sparks against hidden rocks, flashing orange in the twilight. They were a blur of motion against the white snow, a dark streak of desperate love cutting through the winter landscape. Gideon leaned low over the horse's neck, whispering into its ear, urging it faster. Faster. The wind tore at his eyes, blinding him. But he didn't blink. He knew every turn of this trail. He navigated by instinct and adrenaline. He reached the town at a full gallop, the horse's hooves thundering on the frozen mud of the main street. He didn't slow down until he reached the midwife's house. He didn't knock. He hammered on the door. When the sturdy woman opened it, she took one look at the wild-eyed man on the steaming horse, saw the snow in his hair and the terror in his face. And she didn't ask a single question. She grabbed her bag and her coat. Gideon hauled her up onto the horse behind him. "Hold tight," he yelled over the wind. They turned back toward the mountain. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in blood and bruises. They raced the sunset back up the ridge, fighting gravity, fighting the snow, fighting time itself. The Alpha was bringing help, and he would not let the darkness win. The fire crackles warmly now. It is a sound like a contented sigh. The wood snapping and popping in the hearth, casting a soft, golden glow that dances across the timber walls. Outside, the fury has spent itself. The storm that raged against the mountain has passed, leaving behind a silence so deep you can hear the settling of the snow on the roof. The wind, once a screaming banshee, has settled into a gentle hum in the eaves. In the corner of the room, bathed in shadows, a cradle rocks gently. It was carved from sweet-smelling pine, hewn from the forest that protects them. Inside, wrapped in layers of soft wool, a new life sleeps. It is a child born of two worlds, breathing the thin, clean air of the high mountains. A child who will know the stories of the wolf and the laws of the city, but will belong only to himself. Mercy rests in the bed. The flush of life finally returned to her cheeks. Her breathing is steady, a rhythm that matches the peace of the room. Her hand is resting in Gideon's. He sits beside her, still wearing the clothes of his ride, though the snow has melted from his shoulders. His thumb traces the rough skin of her knuckles, a map of the work she did. The wood she chopped, the waiting she endured, while the seasons turned a full circle. They don't need to speak. There are no words left to say that haven't already been said by his return. The silence between them isn't empty anymore. It is full. It is heavy with gratitude. It is full of promises kept. Gideon looks away from her face for a moment, turning his gaze toward the frosted window pane, far below this cabin. The world continues to spin. The stone cities, with their smoke and their noise, still argue about borders and laws. The vast plains, with their endless horizons, still sing their ancient songs to the moon. Gideon knows he could have ruled either. He could have stayed in the capital, a senator in a silk suit, writing laws with a golden pen. He could have returned to the plains, a chief in war paint, leading his people with a lance. He had the strength for both. He had the blood for both, but he chose neither. He looked out the window at the snow-capped peak of Sawtooth Ridge, glowing silver in the moonlight. The mountain is the border. It belongs to no one and everyone. It is the seam where the earth touches the sky. It is the only place where a man made of two conflicting worlds can finally be whole. Gideon stood up slowly, the floorboards creaking softly under his weight. He unbuckled his gun belt. The leather was worn smooth from years of riding. The heavy iron of the peacemaker was cold against his palm. It was the tool of the marshal, the weight of the law. He walked to the wall and hung it on a peg. Right next to it hung his father's old hickory bow, the wood dark with age and oil, the tool of the Apache, the weight of the blood. He stepped back and looked at them, side by side, the iron and the wood, the past and the present, the wolf and the lawman. They were at rest, and so was he. He is the bridge. He always has been. But finally, the bridge has stopped carrying the weight of the world and started carrying the weight of a home. And that, my friends, is the legend of Sawtooth Ridge. It is a story of blood that was spilled, gold that was found, and the hard-won peace that can only be found in the eye of the storm. It is a reminder to all of us that sometimes, to find out who we truly are, we have to lose everything, and then ride through the hell of a winter night to get it back. Thank you for riding with us on this long journey. Thank you for sitting by the fire and letting these ghosts speak one last time. If this story touched your spirit, if you felt the cold of the snow and the warmth of that final fire, please leave a comment below. I read every single one, and I'd love to know which part of Gideon's journey stayed with you. Until the next fire is lit, keep your eyes on the horizon.